Fame is a mask that eats the face. John Updike once wrote that line, but few lived it more completely than Jack Nicholson. Behind the grin that defined an era of Hollywood lay a man slowly vanishing inside his own legend until silence replaced applause.
Los Angeles, 2025. The house on Mulholland Drive stands quiet, blinds drawn, gates locked, no trace of the man who once defined what it meant to be larger than life. For nearly half a century, Jack Nicholson was Hollywood's electric pulse, unpredictable, magnetic, a living paradox of chaos and charm. But today, the man who gave voice to rebellion has disappeared from the stage he once ruled. For over a decade, Nicholson hasn't appeared in public. No new films, no interviews, no Lakers games where his laughter once echoed through the court. The most recent photos, a few blurry paparazzi shots, showed him frail, distant, almost unrecognizable. Rumors swirled: dementia, depression, reclusion. Some said he'd lost his memory. Others whispered he simply lost interest in the world. And yet, the tragedy of Jack Nicholson isn't about old age or isolation. It's about what happens when a man who's lived entirely through his art suddenly has nothing left to perform. When the lights fade and the applause stops, what remains of the persona that once consumed everything? Fame, family, even selfhood. For Nicholson, the story begins long before One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, before The Shining, before the smirk became immortal. It begins in New Jersey, in a small working-class home, where a family secret, one he wouldn't discover until he was 37 years old, would quietly shape the rest of his life. A secret that would make him question everything about who he was and why he'd become the man the world adored. Because Jack Nicholson's rise to greatness wasn't just a story of talent and ambition, it was a long, invisible fight with identity, belonging, and truth. As the industry built him up as an icon of madness, he carried inside a wound that no amount of fame could heal. And perhaps that's the part of his story Hollywood never wanted to explain. How does a man who conquered every room end up alone in silence? That's what we'll uncover, from his childhood secrets to his rise through 1970s counterculture, from the brilliance that changed cinema to the isolation that finally consumed him. Because Jack Nicholson didn't just play madness on screen, he lived at the edge of it. And that edge is where the truth about his tragedy begins.
Jack Nicholson was born on April 22, 1937, in Neptune City, New Jersey, though for most of his life, he didn't know the truth about who he really was. To the neighbors, he was just Jackie, the smiling, mischievous boy raised by a loving mother named Ethel and a grandmother who ran a small beauty parlor downstairs. But the truth, as he would learn decades later, was stranger than any Hollywood script. The woman he thought was his mother was actually his grandmother. The young woman he believed to be his sister was in fact his real mother, a teenage girl named June who had gotten pregnant at 16 and concealed it to avoid scandal. The lie was meant to protect him. Instead, it created a lifelong riddle. Nicholson didn't discover the truth until 1974, when a Time magazine reporter, fact-checking a profile, unearthed public records that revealed the secret. By then, Jack was already a Hollywood star. The revelation hit him like a thunderbolt. It was a pretty dramatic event, he later said, but it wasn't what I'd call traumatizing. After all, I'd been loved. Still, those who knew him well said something shifted. Behind the trademark grin appeared a shadow, a man who had spent his whole life performing, without ever really knowing who he was performing for. Growing up, Jack had been an outsider even among his peers. He was quick, sharp-tongued, rebellious, the kind of kid who challenged authority not out of arrogance, but because he simply couldn't stand pretense. At school, he was voted class clown and most likely to make a scene. His teachers called him too smart for his own good. But underneath the bravado, he carried a deep hunger, a need to be seen, to be heard, to belong. Movies became his refuge. Saturday matinees, flickering and black and white, offered a kind of freedom no real-world stage could. The small-town boy with a fractured sense of self found in film a world where identity could be reinvented, where masks were not lies, but art. When he moved to LA at 17, it wasn't with a plan, just an instinct. He worked as an office assistant at MGM's cartoon division, running errands, delivering coffee. Watching animators draw scenes frame by frame, he realized something essential. Creation was about obsession, about detail, about disappearing into the work until nothing else mattered. Soon, he began taking acting classes, absorbing everything, from Stanislavski's discipline to the raw emotion of the actor's studio. His early mentors noted his intensity. One teacher recalled, "Jack had a way of looking at you, like he was seeing something you didn't know about yourself." But success didn't come quickly. For nearly a decade, he scraped by. Bit parts in B-movies, failed auditions, long nights rewriting scripts that would never be made. Hollywood wasn't waiting for another kid from New Jersey with a crooked smile. And yet that smile, half charming, half dangerous, would become his weapon. He was learning to turn pain into performance, loneliness into power. That alchemy, forged from lies, longing, and the desire to exist fully, would soon catapult him from obscurity into one of the most radical careers in American cinema. But even as he rose, the old wound never left him. It simply learned how to act.
In the late 1950s, Hollywood was still the land of glossy heroes and predictable scripts. And Jack Nicholson was none of those things. He was too raw, too intense, too unpredictable to fit the clean-cut mold of leading men. For years, he was the face you forgot after the credits rolled, a bit player in low-budget westerns, biker flicks, and exploitation films that paid little but kept his dream alive. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing truth. Nicholson's early career was a lesson in patience and pain. He wrote scripts on the side, often for Roger Corman, the B-movie king who gave young, hungry artists a chance when no one else would. It was Corman who saw something unusual in Jack. A darkness behind the grin, a volatility that felt real. In 1963, Nicholson starred in The Terror, a gothic horror film opposite Boris Karloff. It was forgettable to most, but it taught him endurance. Jack never complained, Corman recalled. He'd act, rewrite, hold lights, anything. He was obsessed with the craft. For the next 6 years, Nicholson floated through Hollywood's margins. He was nearly 30 before anyone took notice. By then, he'd already thought about quitting acting, but fate intervened, disguised as a biker movie. In 1969, Easy Rider changed everything. Nicholson wasn't even supposed to be in it. The role of George Hansen, the alcoholic lawyer who joins two drifters on their counterculture journey, was a last-minute replacement. But once Jack appeared on screen, that laugh, that reckless charisma, the film stopped being about the bikers. It was about him. The performance earned him his first Academy Award nomination and turned him overnight from a struggling actor into the voice of a generation. The way he balanced innocence and cynicism, rebellion and vulnerability, made audiences feel like they were watching something raw and unscripted. Hollywood had found its anti-hero. But what the world celebrated as freedom was, for Jack, another mask, one that would follow him for decades. The success of Easy Rider opened doors, but it also created expectations. Directors wanted that guy, the rebel, the madman, the unpredictable force. Nicholson leaned in, choosing roles that blurred the line between sanity and chaos. 5 Easy Pieces, Carnal Knowledge, The Last Detail. Each film felt like another confession,
each character another fragment of himself. And yet, beneath the applause, there was a quiet unease. Fame didn't heal the wound of not knowing who he truly was. It just gave him new ways to hide it. Friends noticed it too. He was magnetic at parties, the loudest laugh, the most daring joke, but often vanished early, retreating into solitude. One close collaborator said, Jack could be in a room full of people who adored him and still look like the loneliest man there. By the early 1970s, Jack Nicholson had become the face of American cinema's revolution, the embodiment of artistic risk and countercultural truth. But behind the rebellion, a quiet fatigue was building. He had spent a lifetime pretending, first for his family, now for the world. And every mask, no matter how perfect, eventually cracks.
By the mid-1970s, Jack Nicholson was no longer just an actor. He was a phenomenon. With One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975, he didn't simply play Randall McMurphy, he became him, a symbol of rebellion against conformity, the man who dared to laugh at authority and paid the price for it. The film swept the Oscars, winning 5 major awards and catapulted Nicholson into the rare air of artists who could define an era. Suddenly, everything he touched turned to gold. Chinatown made him the cool, haunted detective of modern noir. The Shining made him the face of cinematic madness. He was the one actor who could make audiences fear him and love him in the same breath. But at the peak of his fame, Nicholson was living 2 lives. On-screen, he was chaos incarnate, a man losing control. Off-screen, he was the king of Mulholland Drive, holding court at his hilltop home where musicians, painters, and movie stars gathered under clouds of smoke and endless laughter. The parties were legendary. You could find anyone there, recalled singer Harry Nilsson. It was like stepping into the center of Hollywood's heartbeat. Yet, amid the laughter and brilliance, there was restlessness, the sense that no success could quiet the noise inside him. Jack's genius came with a price, one friend said. He couldn't turn it off. The intensity that made him great on screen kept him from resting in real life. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him, but intimacy was fleeting. His long-term relationship with actress Angelica Houston, glamorous, passionate, and famously stormy, became a reflection of his inner conflict. He was irresistible, Houston later said, but impossible. Their love story spanned nearly 2 decades, surviving affairs, heartbreak, and the gravitational pull of 2 people who could never quite stay away from each other. Nicholson's appetite for life was bottomless. Women, art, basketball, philosophy, solitude. He devoured everything. But behind the grin, exhaustion grew. He once admitted, the minute you think you own the world owns you. In private moments, he'd retreat into silence, studying philosophy, reading Nietzsche and Freud, filling journals with fragments of thought about love, death, and fame. He often said he didn't believe in God, but he did believe in karma. Everything comes back, he told a reporter, especially what you try to hide. His performances in the 1980s, Terms of Endearment, Prizzi's Honor, The Witches of Eastwick, and Batman, showed a man who had mastered contradiction. He could play the devil and still make you root for him. He was the rare actor who transcended generations, loved by both critics and the box office. But the spotlight that had once felt like home began to sting. Fame had made him a myth, and myths can't grow old. Every headline about his romantic escapades, every photograph of his grin, deepened the distance between the man and the mask. By the time he accepted his 3rd Oscar for As Good as It Gets in 1998, Jack Nicholson was both Hollywood royalty and its prisoner, a living monument to charisma, wit, and self-destruction. He was still laughing, still shining, but those who knew him best sensed that something inside had gone quiet, a fatigue that couldn't be cured by applause or attention.
The man who had once embodied freedom was beginning to feel trapped in his own legend. And soon, the world would see that even the brightest star casts the darkest shadow.
By the late 1990s, Jack Nicholson had everything: wealth, fame, power, adoration. But what no one saw was how quietly he was beginning to fade from himself. The same intensity that had fueled his rise was now consuming him from the inside out. Nicholson was always known for living without limits. Late nights, endless parties, a constant pursuit of pleasure. But the appetite that once symbolized freedom slowly became a cage. Friends noticed his moods darken, his energy thin out. He wasn't the same Jack, one longtime friend said. It's like he'd gone inward, smiling on the outside, but distant, watching the world from behind glass. As Hollywood changed around him, younger stars, faster fame, shallower stories, Nicholson seemed increasingly alienated. He joked about not understanding the new Hollywood, but beneath the humor was a quiet sadness. The realization that the world he'd once ruled was moving on. He turned down roles that didn't speak to him. He began disappearing for months at a time. Directors whispered about his unpredictability, not the creative fire of old, but something gentler, slower, almost fragile. The man who once devoured every frame of film now hesitated before stepping into the light. The cracks became visible after The Departed, 2006, his last truly celebrated performance. Critics called it a comeback, but Nicholson himself seemed ambivalent. "I'm not sure I have the hunger anymore," he told Vanity Fair in 2010. He was tired of pretending, of fame, of people expecting Jack Nicholson rather than the man himself. Behind the grin was fear, not of failure, but of vanishing himself. He had watched too many of his friends fade away: Marlon Brando, Dennis Hopper, Harry Dean Stanton. Death had become a recurring guest at his famous Mulholland home, a reminder that even icons are mortal. Rumors about his health began circulating in the mid-2010s. Unconfirmed reports suggested memory loss, early dementia. Some said he had quietly retired to avoid embarrassment. Others claimed he had grown depressed after his last serious relationship ended. True or not, the image was heartbreaking. The man once known for his blazing intellect and vitality, now retreating into silence. Paparazzi photos in 2021 showed him sitting alone on his balcony, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline he had once conquered. The grin was gone. In an interview years earlier, he'd confessed a haunting thought. The worst thing is not death, it's disappearing before you die. That fear of fading while still breathing became the essence of his tragedy. Even his old companions noticed. Jack was always the life of the room, one Lakers insider said. But now, when he came to a game, he didn't say much, just sat quietly, like he was somewhere else. Hollywood tried to celebrate him. Tributes, retrospectives, lifetime awards, but he declined most invitations. The man who once filled every camera lens no longer wanted to be seen. For Jack Nicholson, the downfall wasn't a single scandal or failure. It was a slow erosion of energy, of memory, of meaning. And maybe that's what makes his story so human. He didn't crash, he simply faded. Not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion from living too intensely, too long. Behind the myth of madness was a man who had finally run out of worlds to conquer. And somewhere along the way, the performance that began in his youth, the mask he wore for the world, had become too heavy to lift. By the time the world realized Jack Nicholson had quietly withdrawn from public life, it was already too late to ask why. There was no farewell tour, no final interview, no red carpet goodbye. He simply stopped showing up. One day, he was everywhere. The next, he was gone. In a city built on illusion, absence is the one thing that can't be staged. For a while, the tabloids filled in the silence, stories of cognitive decline, whispers of dementia, anonymous friends claiming he could no longer remember his own films. None of it was confirmed, none of it denied. Jack had always believed in mystery, and now his own disappearance had become the last performance of a lifetime spent in front of the camera. Neighbors said the lights in his Mulholland house rarely turned on after dark. He had the same view of Los Angeles he'd looked out upon for 50 years, the glittering sprawl that had made and devoured countless dreams. But now, it seemed, he had no need for it. The man who once devoured the world was now content to watch it fade. Those who saw him described moments of both clarity and confusion. He'd reminisce about old films, quote lines perfectly, then lose his train of thought. Sometimes he'd smile at nothing in particular, as if remembering a joke only he could hear. "He's peaceful," one friend said. "He's not in pain, he's just gone somewhere else." There was a tragic beauty in it, the greatest performer of madness, now drifting toward a quiet, irreversible stillness. In his prime, Nicholson had played men driven to the edge of reason: McMurphy, Torrance, Schmidt. Audiences saw art, but in hindsight, those roles felt prophetic, a man subconsciously rehearsing his own vanishing. "He always understood loneliness," director Mike Nichols once said. "Even when he was the loudest person in the room, you could feel that ache underneath." Perhaps that ache had simply outgrown the stage. Jack's final film, How Do You Know, 2010, wasn't a grand finale. It was an ordinary romantic comedy, almost forgettable. Yet in hindsight, its title feels painfully poetic. How do you know when it's time to leave? When your story has been told. When your reflection no longer recognizes you. Hollywood, of course, doesn't know how to grieve its own. It prefers endings written with fireworks, not silence. But Jack's exit was perfectly him, mysterious, unapologetic, defiant of spectacle. He once told The Guardian, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of not being me anymore." And in the end, that's exactly what happened. He didn't die in front of us. He just stopped being the Jack Nicholson we knew, the voice, the grin, the fire. In a way, the tragedy isn't that he vanished, it's that the world never noticed the man behind the myth slipping away long before he disappeared. From Neptune City to Mulholland Drive, from the laughter of Easy Rider to the horror of The Shining, his life was an unbroken circle of brilliance and solitude. Now, in that same solitude, he has found his last role, the man who walked away before the curtain fell. Because for Jack Nicholson, perhaps the final act was not madness, not death, but silence. And in that silence, the legend remains exactly as he always wanted: untamed, unexplainable, unforgettable.
Jack Nicholson's disappearance didn't end his story, it preserved it. In a way, his retreat from public life became the final scene of a career that had always blurred the line between man and myth. Without ever saying a word, he reminded the world that silence can be more powerful than applause. What remains today is not just his filmography, but his presence, that unmistakable combination of danger and warmth, charm and chaos. His characters weren't performances, they were manifestations of something primal. When Jack smiled, it was never just acting. It was an invitation to peer into the beautiful, terrifying depths of human contradiction. Few actors have embodied rebellion the way Nicholson did. In an era obsessed with rules, he was the rule breaker who still made you believe in truth. His characters didn't offer comfort, they exposed you. From McMurphy's defiance in Cuckoo's Nest to Torrance's descent in The Shining, from Jake Gitt's doomed pursuit of justice in Chinatown to Melvin Udall's broken tenderness and As Good as It Gets, every role asked the same question: What does it mean to stay human when the world demands a mask? And perhaps that's what makes his story feel timeless, because Jack himself lived that question. He wore masks better than anyone, but deep down he never stopped searching for what was real. His legacy reaches beyond acting. Nicholson changed how Hollywood thought about power and vulnerability. He proved that masculinity could include madness, empathy, fragility, that strength didn't have to mean control. He taught generations of actors that truth isn't in the lines you deliver, but in the silence you dare to hold. Angelica Houston once said, "Jack has the soul of an artist and the heart of a child." That duality, the child and the genius, the sinner and the saint, was the essence of his appeal. In the years since his retreat, tributes have poured in from younger actors: Leonardo DiCaprio, Joaquin Phoenix, Christian Bale, all citing Nicholson as the standard of fearless authenticity. "He made it okay to be unpredictable," DiCaprio said. "He made it okay to be real." And yet the most haunting reflection may come from Nicholson himself. Decades ago, in an interview few remembered until now, he said quietly, "I've lived the dream. But the thing about dreams is, they don't last. You wake up, and if you're lucky, you remember what it felt like." Today, that quote feels prophetic. The man who lived the dream eventually woke up, leaving behind a legacy of brilliance, mystery, and truth. And maybe that's the most human ending of all. Not flames, not fame, but stillness. The quiet dignity of a man who finally stopped pretending.
In the end, Jack Nicholson's story is more than Hollywood mythology. It's a reflection of the machine that builds gods and then forgets the men inside them. He was both the creation and the casualty of an industry that feeds on identity until there's nothing left to give. His tragedy isn't in madness or illness, but in the quiet truth that fame cannot fill the space where the self once lived. Behind every smile, every award, every mythic role was a man who just wanted to be understood. And maybe by stepping away, he finally was. Because some legends don't fade, they simply choose to disappear on their own terms. Behind the glory, where fame ends and the truth begins.